Good day, biology, and welcome to today's lecture on photosynthesis. There'll be about 2 to 3 parts to this lecture. We'll start by diving into the chloroplast by looking through this eye of Sauron that's in your front page. No, that's really a guard cell with a stomata opening right here to allow gas exchange, huge in transpiration, also huge in allowing CO2 in for photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, one of my favorites, and it occurs in the chloroplast. So remember, we just got done doing cellular respiration where glucose and oxygen are used to generate a lot of ATP, like 36 to 38 ATP, and as a byproduct, you get carbon dioxide and water. Well, photosynthesis is kind of going to be the other side of that. In this case, carbon dioxide is going to be taken from the air and water from the roots inside plants or algae, although algae don't have roots. And that carbon dioxide and water is then going to be turned into sugar, glucose, and as a byproduct, we get oxygen. So really, we're creating sugar here, and we're going to use energy from the sun to create that sugar. A common misconception is the energy creates the sugar. No, carbon dioxide is bound together to create sugar. We just need energy to form that sugar, and that comes from the sun. But the sugar is actually made from carbon dioxide. It just doesn't magically appear from light. That would be pretty awesome, and I think you can do that in Star Trek, but not really yet in any of our true real-world experiences. But someday that replicator maybe will work. So photosynthesis, awesome. I just think this is a really cool microscope picture. So I'm going to start with that. We are going to start quickly by going through the chloroplast, very similar to a mitochondria. Also thought to have come from an ancient bacteria that was swallowed up. And we see lots of bacteria that do photosynthesis, so this makes sense. And then they were eaten by algae, and then those algae became plants. Yada, 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 with evolution. This is what a chloroplast actually looks like under a microscope, an electron microscope, and we'll look at like a drawing of it, but I want you to see what it actually looks like. And these little stacks, that's where photosynthesis really takes place. That's where the light is going to be absorbed. These are called granules, and each little stack is called a thylakoid, all membrane-bound organelles. Think of the surface area in here with all those membrane-bound organelles. So, just like the mitochondria, we have an outer membrane that probably came from its eukaryotic host and an inner membrane that is still part of the bacteria. We have inner membrane space here, but the difference with this inner membrane in chloroplast is we form these little discs. These are membrane discs, and inside of them has a lot of space, and we call these thylakoids. Okay, like the mitochondria, the cytoplasm of the mitochondria is called the matrix. Well, the cytoplasm of the chloroplast is called the stroma. Don't mistake that with stomata. Stroma is the cytoplasm of the chloroplast, and it's where chemical reactions are going to occur as well, just like it would be the cytoplasm of the cell or the matrix of the mitochondria. So stromata is here, and then these discs are called thylakoids. A whole stack is called a granum. Probably never test you on that. And lumen is the space in between. Lumen is actually always the space in between. So big things we're going to need to know is the stroma, because this is where the dark reaction or the light-independent reaction of photosynthesis occurs. This is where all the sugar is made. And then these thylakoids is where all the energy is obtained from the sun, and also where oxygen is produced. So, I mean, really, I really like oxygen. I really like sugar. These are pretty amazing little organelles / bacteria that live inside of us. Just to give you an idea, as we're talking about these, we're going to talk about pigments. Some of you have already talked about pigments. Some of you have not yet. But these little thylakoids are full of pigments, and pigments absorb light energy. So just to give you an idea, this is what is absorbed, and the light absorbed is where the energy comes from in plants. So if you ever see this, know these peaks is where you're going to get the best growth of the plant. You're going to get the most sugar production for photosynthesis because we get the most light absorbed. And so you should notice that it's in the color blue down here, and over here in the color red that we get our most growth. These are just the different types of pigments in there. I'm not really going to test you guys on that, so we're not going to get there. So basics of photosynthesis, definitely be writing this down in your notebooks. And here we go. So formula for photosynthesis is the exact opposite of cellular respiration. We get 6 carbon dioxides plus 12 waters. I'm okay if you do 6 waters here as well. Probably should do 6, but 12 is a little more advanced. So let's pretend that's a 6. 6 carbon dioxide, 6 waters, 1 sugar, glucose, gives us, don't worry about that water, and 6 oxygen. So we're going to ignore those two. I decided I don't want to be that intense. Okay. What it does is it's going to take energy from light and uses it to synthesize sugar. It's an anabolic. Yep, I just gave you the answer. What type of reaction is this? You're putting things together. Remember, this is all going to be enzyme mediated, step by step, just like cellular respiration. And it is an anabolic reaction. Okay, some new vocab. I'll give you some time to write down. Photolysis or photolysis is going to be the splitting of water. This is going to produce electrons, hydrogens, and it's where we make oxygen. So big word. Photolysis, remember we had a glycolysis, and so photolysis is light splitting. We're actually splitting water in this case, so lysis to split. So photolysis splits water, and we end up getting hydrogen and oxygen out of that, plus some high energy electrons. Remember when we split glucose, we also got high energy electrons and hydrogens. We did not produce oxygen, though. We actually used oxygen in that. Photophosphorylation, big word, but it just means the production of ATP in photosynthesis. So it's using light energy to phosphorylate ATP. If you remember right, in the electron transport chain of cellular respiration, we call it oxidative phosphorylation, and we will come back to that again. Give you a second to write those down, and then we're going to get into how light is used, how splitting water and light energy is used to make a lot of ATP, and then that ATP is going to be used in our next lecture to make glucose. Okay. Photosynthesis is going to involve 2 major stages. This is the stuff you will be tested on for sure. You need to know what happens here inside and out. The actual steps of how it happened, I want you to have a good grasp of. You don't have to be super, you don't have to know it super well. So the light-dependent reaction, meaning this reaction is going to require light, is going to occur in those thylakoid stacks we talked about earlier. And what happens here is we're going to split water, and we're going to use that energy from splitting water and energy from the sun to excite electrons. And those excited electrons, high energy electrons, are going to move along an electron transport chain just like occurs in the mitochondria in the electron transport chain, and it's going to produce ATP. It's just a little different how we get the energy for it. That is the light-dependent reaction. We're also going to use an electron transport chain to make NADPH, which is very similar to NADH, which is that electron carrier. So really the light-dependent reaction is taking energy from the sun, and it's transferring it into usable energy for the plant cells, and then that usable energy in the chloroplasts are used to make sugar. Okay. So light-dependent occurs in the thylakoids. It involves 2 electron transport chain systems. The first one is photosystem 2. Yeah, I don't know why it's photosystem 2 and not 1. I would think the first one would be 1, but hey, I am not the scientist who discovered this, so they get the choice. Photosystem 2, and we call it 680 because that's the wavelength of light that energizes this. Not super important for you. In photosystem 2, we're going to have that photolysis occurs, where we split water. So we get the production of oxygen in photosystem 2. We also make a lot of ATP here. Okay? The second electron system, transport chain system, is photosystem 1, 700 nanometer light, and this is going to produce something called NADPH. This is just an electron carrier, just like NADH, but it's got a phosphorus in it. But for us, we're just going to pretend this P means plant. Okay, so NADP is plant. It's really phosphorus because this is actually in human cells too, but nothing you need to know has it in a human cell to help us remember P means plant. Okay, so NADPH is a plant. NADP is reduced to NADPH. Okay. So really the overlying part of the light-dependent reaction is it's going to use an electron transport chain to make ATP and NADPH, both high-energy molecules that we can then harvest the energy here to synthesize glucose in the Calvin cycle. So that is our next one, the light-independent reaction. We will do this in our next lecture, and that is called the Calvin cycle. That part is going to occur in the stroma, which is like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. And it's that anabolic reaction where glucose is made. That glucose can then be turned into starch, cellulite, I don't want that. Cellulose can also be transformed into fat. And then actually the plant can take nitrogen and sulfur from the soil and make proteins out of this glucose. So it is really where all the material that we use for life pretty much comes from. I think it's awesome. This is a cyclical cycle. So remember, when we talk about enzymes, this is going to be very similar to the Krebs cycle, that it's going to run in a circle. I think you guys can see my mouse. Where the light-dependent reaction is typically more of a chain reaction, although there is a cyclical nature to it as well. I don't know if we'll get to that part. And so this cyclical cycle is going to require the ATP and NADPH that were produced in the light-dependent reaction. Okay, that was probably a lot of writing. If you guys want to take a short break now, this would be a good time. You can pause. Well, relax your hands, because we are now going to go through the steps of the light-dependent reaction. Caveat on pigments, already talked about them. They are located within the thylakoid membrane. This is kind of a cool picture. That's one reason I put it in here. And you see all these proteins in here. These are pigments. They are what are going to absorb light energy, and we call them the photosystems. And then there's going to be a lot more to that. So this is my photosystems from the picture before. Okay, so this is all my pigments. They're lying in the thylakoid membrane. And so I'll have these little pictures to go step by step as we go through this. So the first step is sunlight's coming down, and these pigments are absorbing the wavelengths of energy pretty much in the blue and red spectrum of light, and they're energizing electrons in these chlorophylls. The energy is then passed from one chlorophyll pigment to another chlorophyll pigment till we find something called the reaction center. So in the first part of the light-dependent reaction, light is absorbed by photosystem 2, and that energy is passed between molecules. So it's passed between these pigment molecules until it reaches something called the reaction center. So when energy arrives at the reaction center, 2 electrons are excited. By excited, I mean they get lots of energy, and they are ejected from the chlorophyll molecule. And then these high energy electrons are going to be passed down the electron transport chain, just like it was in cellular respiration. That energy is going to pump hydrogens into the lumen of the thylakoid, which is going to create a proton gradient, and that proton gradient will power ATP synthase to make ATP. So that is basically what is happening here, but we get these 2 electrons that are ejected from the reaction center from the chlorophyll. Once that happens, though, we need to replace these electrons. So these electrons have left. This cycle needs to continue on and on, so we need to replace these electrons with something, and that something is water. Okay. Here's just a little idea of the energy coming from light. It's bounced around until it gets to that electron center and sends it off. Okay, so we need to replace the 2 electrons, and water is going to be split by an enzyme, and it's going to generate 2 electrons. Those are going to replace the electrons that got excited. They will then be replaced. So water replaces the electrons. We also end up getting the hydrogen, which is going to be used to make the proton gradient. And most importantly, well, not most importantly, it's all important, oxygen is produced so that we have oxygen to do cellular respiration and go the other way. What is the process of water being split called? A little review for you. And you should have come up with, what is photolysis? Excellent. You have won $1,000. So now we have those excited electrons. Already kind of talked about it. They're going to be passed down the electrons transport chain. At each stage, they're losing energy. That energy lost is used to pump those hydrogens up into the thylakoid space, which is going to drive that thing called chemiosmosis. Remember, that's where those hydrogens then come from a high gradient to a low gradient, turn the little ATP synthase, and we make a lot of ATP. For every water molecule split, you actually get 18 ATP. So that's pretty good. But if you remember right, cellular respiration gives us way more ATP, like double. So that's why plants do both photosynthesis and ATP, because, or photosynthesis and cellular respiration, because cellular respiration actually nets a lot more ATP than does photosynthesis. So we do need 18 ATP to make glucose, but glucose then gives us 36 ATP. So much better trade-off system for our cell. Okay, and I ask you guys, this goes back to one of our vocab words at the beginning. Wow, we've had 2 vocab words. What is this process called where electrons are passed down the electron transport chain and we make ATP using energy from the light? You should come up with photophosphorylation. Remember, phosphorylation is adding a phosphate group to ADP. We are not done with the whole how the electron transport chain works, but for a little review of the electron transport chain, just explain how chemiosmosis works. I think I've talked about this quite a bit, but what is the final product of chemiosmosis? You should be thinking to yourself, it is ATP. What enzyme phosphorylates ADP to ATP? This one's really hard. It's ATP synth. What do enzymes end in? Oh, I can't remember. ATP synth. Ose. No, ose is sugar. ATP synthase. Synthase. That's right. ATP synthase. Correct. And what causes this enzyme to run? So what powers the ATP synthase is a proton gradient. The gradient is created by excited electrons powering the active transport of hydrogen through the thylakoid membrane into the thylakoid space. We get that high concentration of hydrogen, and it passes through ATP synthase. Very similar to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. The difference is this occurs in a thylakoid instead of the inner membrane space of the mitochondria. Same exact system, same enzymes and everything. It's pretty awesome. Okay. How is photophosphorylation different than oxidative phosphorylation? I want you guys to take a few minutes to answer that question. I will actually be putting this in an ed puzzle, which I just decided. So sorry, guys, you're getting an ed puzzle where you're going to have to type this in. Okay. So you should come to electrons come from the splitting of water in photophosphorylation. In oxidative phosphorylation or in cellular respiration, electrons come from the oxidation of sugar. Remember, so we split that sugar to make NADHs. That's where the energy came from. In this case, the energy comes from the splitting of water and light, okay? But the electrons actually came from the water. The energy came from light. One occurs in the thylakoids, while the other is the cristae of the mitochondria. Photophosphorylation produces an oxygen as a byproduct, where oxidative phosphorylation, oxygen is actually the final electron acceptor, and it actually forms water. So very similar, but kind of opposite things. I want you guys to be able to compare and contrast those. I gotta, just a second. I don't know what to do. Okay, sorry about that. This is what happens when we're in school. And I gotta rearrange myself because I just took a 5-minute break to talk to somebody. You guys didn't need to know that, sorry. I could splice it out, but I want you to know. So we have just finished with photosystem 2. And so here we have my little reaction center, a little recap of what's happened. Light energy is absorbed into the pigments. That energy is transferred to excite 2 electrons. Those excited electrons then get passed down the electron transport chain. As this is happening, hydrogen is being pumped into the inner thylakoid space, creating a proton gradient, and that proton gradient is going to go through ATP synthase and create ATP. Now we have 2 electrons. Their energy is pretty much spent after being tossed down the electron transport chain and pumping hydrogen ions against the gradient. So these are now spent, and they are going to go into photosystem 1. So similar to photosystem 2, light energy is going to excite 2 electrons to send through an electron transport chain, and those electrons are replaced by these electrons here in the photosystem 2 electrons, replace them in photosystem 1. So photosystem 1 is going to eject 2 electrons that are also going to go through an electron transport chain, and they are replaced by these 2 electrons. Quick question for you, where did those electrons originally come from? And you should remember it was the splitting of water. Okay, so here I know I'm repeating myself, but I think that helps you guys. Light energy is absorbed by photosystem 1 and is passed to the reaction center of the chlorophyll. 2 high energy electrons are boosted and ejected from the reaction center. The electrons lost by photosystem 1 are replaced by these electrons from photosystem 2. Okay, electrons are now passed down another electron transport chain, a little bit shorter, but this electron transport chain is a little bit different. It's still going to create like a hydrogen gradient, but instead of making ATP, we're actually going to make NADPH. So NADPH is going to grab these 2 electrons. Every NADP takes on 2 electrons, and they have lots of energy, and these NADPHs are going to be used along with these ATP in the dark reaction or the Calvin cycle. So remember these 2 electrons, they're now in NADH. They're eventually going to end up in sugar. But those 2 electrons are now lost from the system. And remember, the whole thing is replaced by water right here at the beginning being split. So we get that water comes in here. The hydrogen from that water goes here. Oxygen goes off and makes us really happy to be able to breathe. So 2 electrons, NADP plus NH hydrogen ion are used to form 1 NADH molecule. That's really all I want you to know about this second part, is it's an electron transport chain, and we're going to form an NADPH molecule. Very high energy, going to be very important to form sugar. A little more complicated one to look at this, but kind of gives you an idea. We have our stroma out here, our thylakoid space, and just the electron transport chains, everything producing what we make. So, quick review of the light-dependent reaction, and we'll be done with our notes today. Which photosystem is the first to receive energy from light? Yes, it should be 1, but it is 2. Photosystem 2 is first. It's just hard. What is a product of photosystem 2? You should know that it's oxygen and ATP. photosystem 1 gives us this one product, reduced NADPH. And where do the electrons from the light-dependent reaction come from? And they come from water. After photolysis, water produces the electrons.